Kia ora. Today I'm going to talk to you briefly about ethics in science. Ethics is important in all branches of science, and I'm going to talk about it in a general sense, but I guess because of my background, there will be a particular emphasis on the ethics that we employ when we're working with people or with animals. But to start with, we need to think about what ethics is. Ethics is the branch of knowledge that deals with moral principles, the principles that govern a person's behaviour or tell them how to do something when they're conducting an activity. It's really about knowing how to do the right thing, and then presumably doing the right thing once you know what that is. I want to approach it from a historical perspective, and I want to talk about the three main branches of ethical theory that are constant throughout Western ethical thought processes. I've used their historical names to identify them here, but actually each of these historical theories has widened into a whole set of theories that governs a particular way of thinking about the world. And so in their newer forms, they are still very important in terms of the way that we think about things. Let's start with teleology. Aristotle developed teleology, and it's recorded and has come down to us in Plato's Metaphysics. Teleology suggests that things are defined by their purpose. And so if you were to ask a question like, what is a chair? The answer to that question would be, a chair is a thing whose purpose is to be sat on. When you think about things whose purpose is to be sat on, you can think about a whole variety of different things whose purpose is to be sat on, which are chairs. But what Aristotle said was that somewhere in this set of chairs, there is a perfect chair which perfectly encompasses the set of things that are chairs. And so the perfect chair is the most perfect, the best chair that a chair could ever be, the most perfect thing whose function could be to be sat on. Aristotle said that perfect chair existed in the world of the forms, and the world of the forms was a place where everything existed in its most perfect form. And so when Aristotle defined the theory of teleology, he said that the telos of a chair is to be sat on. That's an extrinsic telos because it relies on usefulness to people. The usefulness of a chair to be sat on is not necessarily useful to the chair itself, but it is useful to the people that sit on the chair, and so it's extrinsic telos. Some things have intrinsic telos, and an example that Aristotle was very fond of was an acorn. The intrinsic telos of an acorn is to be an oak tree, to develop into that oak tree. And the oak tree is the most perfect thing that an acorn can become. People have intrinsic telos, and so special ethical obligations apply when doing science with people. Animals also have intrinsic telos, and special ethical obligations apply when doing science with animals. Okay, let's move forward in history now. We're going to talk about the next 1,000 years in a minute or so. An obscure prophet was crucified in a backwater part of the Roman Empire, and that prophet's followers combined the theoretical thought and philosophy of Aristotle with the history of a tribal religion from the area. They changed the world of the forms into a thing called heaven, and they decided that that's where God was, and that became the major religion in the Western world. 1,000 or so years later, that world developed into a medieval culture, still holding on to that religion, and started to develop systems of laws that would be passed down through the ages. This is the Magna Carta, which is one of those laws, but the idea of a law gives us the next major ethical theory, which is deontology. Deontology says that the morality of an action should be based on whether that action is right or wrong given a series of rules. And originally it was couched in an authoritative manner, saying that God is the authority, these are the rules, and so when we obey those rules, we are lining up with the authority, which is God. The newer deontological theories hold on to those rules, but they turn the authority away from God to look at things like social license. And so they say things like society develops rules and we adhere to those rules because the rules have social license, which they're given from our society. It's a kind of a rights-based thinking. People have rights, and so rules should be made to protect people. Animals have rights, and so rules should be made to protect animals. Back to history, and another few centuries later, with the Enlightenment and the development of what we would call modern science, those rules seem to be less relevant than they were and seem to need some other kind of theory to sit on top of them. And so the theory of utilitarianism was developed. Utilitarianism looks at maximizing utility, and utility is a property in an object that tends to produce benefit, advantage, pleasure, good, happiness, or to prevent the happening of mischief, pain, evil to a party whose interest is being considered. So we have a concept of benefit or harm to interested parties. An action is right or good if it leads to good outcomes. And so people are emotionally sensitive. Their utility should be maximized. Animals are emotionally sensitive. Their utility should be maximized. And so those are the three main Western ethical theories that we work with primarily in the sciences. Teleology says an action is right if its intended purpose is good. And the ethics of teleology have really become value ethics in the modern world. And so they are the ethics of valuing something because of what it is, because of its purpose, because of what it does. And a lot of conservation ethic is value ethic. We value a forest or a woodland or a hillside or a rocky outcrop or an ecosystem because it's good, because we value it. And so it has a telos, an extrinsic telos, which we value and which we try and preserve. The rights-based ethical theories, based on deontology, an action is right if it obeys the rules, come to us with things like human rights, animal rights, all those things that we bestow upon people or animals because we believe it's right to do so and because they believe that they have a right to that thing. So, for example, basic human rights, we believe that humans have a right to life and that it is wrong to take away that life from that human. That's a deontological approach. And utilitarianism has become various forms of consequentialism where an action is right if it leads to good outcomes. And so it's not necessarily the action per se that decides whether the action is right, but it's the outcomes that flow from an action that tell us whether or not it was a good action. Each of those theories has a whole stack of problems, but the main problems are these. Teleology, the value ethics, talks about intentions, and as my grandmother used to tell me, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. It doesn't really matter that we had good intentions if we did something foolish and it led to a poor outcome. Deontology has issues in that when we make general rules, they don't always seem to fit well the circumstances that we find ourselves in. And so there are issues where we feel that the rules don't really fit the situation, and so deontology doesn't sometimes feel right. And utilitarianism or consequentialism has issues because we can't predict the future. How can we know that our action today will have good or bad outcomes tomorrow? Because we live in a very complicated and unpredictable world. So there I've given you three of the major Western ethical theories and told you exactly why each of them is really not that much use. And the problem is that we have to decide how we're going to behave as we do science and how we're going to do the right thing. And so I couldn't leave you without giving you a set of principles to help you decide how to do the right thing. And these are really concepts that you can think about when doing the right thing is important. First one is autonomy. People have autonomy, people have a right to decide for themselves what to do. And so if you are going to do the right thing, you should behave in a way which gives others autonomy, which allows them to decide for themselves what the good thing is for them. You should attempt to avoid harm as far as possible to the people that you are working with, working on behalf of, coming into contact with. And you should act in a way which maximizes the benefit to those people. You should think very carefully about how you behave when you have special relationships with people, because your ethical outlook towards those people might be marred by the relationships that you have. So, for example, if you have a family member, you might be prejudiced towards doing more good things for them than you would for somebody else. If you have somebody who is senior to you at work, you might be predisposed to doing nice things for them so that they promote you. And so we need to look out for special relationships because they often come with privilege and benefit for ourselves, which can get in the way of our ethical thinking. And finally, I want to talk about justice, because justice is one of those concepts which encompasses all of those other concepts. Justice is the extent to which the benefits and burdens of what you do will be fairly distributed. If you do something that will cause some benefit and some harm, will it cause benefit and harm to the same group of individuals, people or animals? If so, it's probably a just thing. If it causes harm to one group and benefit to a different group, then the chances are that it is a less just thing. And so if you think about the justice of what you do, that will take you a long way in terms of deciding which of the theories gives you the best outcome in a particular circumstance. So that was a very brief introduction to ethics in science. I hope it was helpful, and particularly I hope that it gave you some inspiration to go and look more deeply into the subject and to see how it affects the science that you propose to do. Kia ora.